Carl Jung discovered something that will fundamentally change how you interact with the world. In his decades of clinical practice, he observed that people who constantly explain themselves are unconsciously giving away their psychological power. This isn't about being rude or dismissive. It's about understanding a profound truth that most people never realize: the compulsive need to justify your actions, thoughts, and existence to others is actually a form of psychological self-destruction. Jung noticed that his most psychologically powerful patients shared one remarkable trait: they rarely felt the need to explain themselves to anyone, not because they were arrogant, but because they understood something fundamental about human psychology that the rest of us miss completely. What Jung discovered will shock you, because it goes against everything we've been taught about communication and relationships. But before we dive into this topic, I want to ask you something. How old are you, and where are you watching us from? Do you also find yourself constantly trying to explain yourself, even when others don't understand you? After subscribing to the channel and liking the video, write your experiences in the comments along with your name. Let's examine your story together. You can also send this video to your loved ones so they can learn these teachings too. Jung's insight began with a simple observation that changed everything. During his therapeutic sessions, he noticed a clear pattern among his patients. Those who struggled most with anxiety, depression, and relationship problems were the same ones who spent enormous amounts of mental energy explaining themselves to others. They would justify their career choices to their parents, explain their relationship decisions to friends, defend their lifestyle to colleagues, and constantly seek validation for their most basic life choices. At first, Jung thought this was simply a symptom of low self-esteem, but as he delved deeper into their psychological profiles, he discovered something far more disturbing. These individuals weren't just seeking approval, they were unconsciously participating in what Jung called psychological subordination. Every time they explained themselves, they were positioning the other person as a psychological authority over their life decisions. Think about what happens when you feel compelled to explain yourself. You're essentially saying, "Your opinion of my choices matters more than my own inner knowing." You're placing the other person in a position of judgment over your life. Without realizing it, you're asking for permission to be who you are. This is what Jung meant when he said that explaining yourself destroys your psychological sovereignty. Jung observed that truly confident individuals operate from what he called psychological autonomy. They make decisions based on their inner compass, not on the anticipated reactions of others. When questioned about their choices, they might share information if they choose to, but they never feel compelled to justify themselves. This isn't about being secretive or withdrawn. It's about maintaining your psychological independence. The most profound part of Jung's discovery was this: people actually respect you more when you stop explaining yourself. This seems counterintuitive, because we've been taught that communication and transparency are always good. But Jung found that excessive self-explanation actually signals insecurity and invites others to question your judgment. When you constantly justify your decisions, you're unconsciously telling people that your choices are questionable and need external validation. Remember, Jung studied thousands of patients over decades. He saw this pattern repeatedly. The people who explained themselves the least were the ones others naturally turned to for guidance and leadership. They possessed what Jung called natural authority, not because they were domineering, but because they demonstrated confidence in their own judgment. But here's where Jung's insight becomes truly transformative. He discovered that the compulsion to explain yourself often stems from what he called shadow projection. You're not really explaining yourself to others, you're explaining yourself to the critical voice in your own head. That voice that questions every decision, that second-guesses every choice, that makes you feel like you need to justify your existence. Jung realized that when we constantly explain ourselves, we're actually externalizing our own inner critic. We project our self-doubt onto others, and then try to convince them, and ourselves, that we're making the right choices. This creates an exhausting cycle of seeking external validation for internal decisions. The most successful people Jung studied had learned to quiet this inner critic through what he called individuation, the process of becoming psychologically whole and self-directed. They had developed what Jung termed inner authority, the ability to trust their own judgment without needing constant confirmation from others. Think about the people in your life who command natural respect. Do they constantly explain their choices? Do they justify their decisions to everyone around them? Probably not. They might share their reasoning if asked, but they don't feel compelled to defend their life choices. This isn't because they're cold or uncaring. It's because they've developed psychological independence. Jung's research showed that this principle applies to every area of life. In relationships, constantly explaining yourself to your partner actually weakens the bond because it signals that you don't trust your own judgment. In your career, over-explaining your decisions to colleagues diminishes your professional authority. In social situations, justifying your choices makes others more likely to question them. But Jung discovered something even more significant. He found that people are naturally drawn to those who demonstrate self-assurance through their actions rather than their explanations. When you stop explaining yourself, people begin to see you as someone who knows what they're doing. This creates what Jung called psychological magnetism. Others are attracted to your confidence and self-direction. Now you might be thinking, but what about being accountable? What about transparency? Jung wasn't advocating for secrecy or irresponsibility. He was pointing out the difference between sharing information by choice and compulsively justifying yourself out of insecurity. There's a huge psychological difference between saying, "I chose this because, and I need you to understand why I." Jung's clinical notes reveal fascinating case studies of patients who transformed their lives by learning to stop explaining themselves. One patient, a successful businessman, realized he had been unconsciously seeking his father's approval for every major decision well into his 40s. When he stopped explaining his business choices to his father, their relationship actually improved because it removed the dynamic of judgment and approval seeking. Another patient, a woman in her 30s, discovered that constantly explaining her life choices to her friends was actually damaging those friendships. Her friends felt burdened by her need for validation and began to see her as insecure. When she stopped seeking their approval for her decisions, they began to respect her more, and their friendships deepened. Jung observed that this transformation happens in 3 stages. First, you become aware of how often you explain yourself unnecessarily. Most people are shocked when they start paying attention to this pattern. We explain our food choices, our clothing selections, our career decisions, our relationship status, even our hobbies to people who haven't asked for explanations. The second stage is what Jung called the discomfort phase. When you stop explaining yourself, you feel anxious because you're breaking a deeply ingrained pattern. You worry that people will think you're rude or secretive. But Jung found that this discomfort is actually a sign that you're reclaiming your psychological power. The third stage is liberation. Of Underweightsjoppy. You realize that most people don't actually need or want your explanations. They're often more comfortable when you demonstrate confidence in your choices rather than seeking their validation. This is when you begin to experience what Jung called authentic presence, the ability to be yourself without apology or justification. Jung's insight becomes even more powerful when you consider the energy dynamics involved. Every time you explain yourself unnecessarily, you're giving away psychological energy. You're directing your mental resources toward managing other people's opinions instead of focusing on your own growth and goals. This creates what Jung termed energy depletion. You feel drained because you're constantly managing external perceptions. But when you stop explaining yourself, that energy becomes available for more productive uses. You can focus on actually making good decisions rather than justifying them. You can invest in relationships based on mutual respect rather than approval seeking. You can pursue your goals with the full force of your psychological energy. Jung also discovered that stopping the compulsion to explain yourself has unexpected benefits in your relationships. When you're not constantly seeking validation, you become more present with others. You listen better, because you're not internally rehearsing justifications for your own choices. You offer more genuine support, because you're not preoccupied with managing their opinion of you. This principle is especially important in romantic relationships. Jung found that couples who constantly explain themselves to each other often develop what he called psychological codependency. Each partner becomes responsible for validating the other's choices, which creates an exhausting dynamic of mutual caretaking rather than mutual respect. In healthy relationships, Jung observed, partners share their thoughts and feelings freely, but don't feel compelled to justify their individual choices. They trust each other's judgment and offer support, without requiring detailed explanations for every decision. This creates space for both individuals to grow and evolve, without feeling like they need permission from their partner. Jung's research also revealed the impact of cultural conditioning on our compulsion to explain ourselves. Many of us were raised in families where we had to justify every choice to authoritarian parents. We learned that our decisions weren't valid unless they were approved by an external authority. This pattern then gets carried into our adult relationships, where we unconsciously seek the same validation from friends, partners, and colleagues. Breaking this pattern requires what Jung called psychological independence, the recognition that you are the ultimate authority on your own life. This doesn't mean ignoring wise counsel or feedback from others. It means making decisions based on your own values and judgment rather than on the anticipated approval of others. Jung noticed that people who master this principle often experience what he termed natural leadership. Others are drawn to their self-assurance and begin to seek their guidance. This happens not because they're trying to be leaders, but because they demonstrate the psychological qualities that others admire: confidence, independence, and self-direction. But Jung warned against taking this principle to an extreme. There's a difference between healthy psychological independence and antisocial behavior. The goal isn't to become cold or dismissive of others' feelings. It's to develop the ability to share yourself authentically without feeling compelled to justify your existence. Jung's patients who successfully implemented this principle reported remarkable changes in their lives. They experienced less anxiety because they weren't constantly worried about others' judgments. They made better decisions because they weren't second-guessing themselves based on anticipated reactions. They developed stronger relationships because they were relating to others from a place of self-respect rather than neediness. One of Jung's most profound insights was that explaining yourself often comes from a fear of rejection. We think that if we can just make people understand our reasoning, they'll accept our choices. But Jung found that the opposite is often true. Constant explanation actually invites rejection because it signals that we're not confident in our own decisions. When you stop explaining yourself, you send a different message. I've made this choice and I'm comfortable with it. This confidence is attractive to others because it demonstrates psychological maturity. People are more likely to respect decisions that are presented with quiet confidence than those that come with lengthy justifications. Jung also discovered that this principle applies to your relationship with yourself. Many people have an internal dialogue where they constantly justify their choices to themselves. This creates mental exhaustion and prevents clear decision-making. When you trust your own judgment without needing to convince yourself with elaborate reasoning, you free up mental energy for more creative and productive thinking. The practice of not explaining yourself also develops what Jung called psychological presence. When you're not mentally rehearsing justifications, you become more aware of what's actually happening in the present moment. You can respond to situations more authentically because you're not filtering everything through the lens of how you'll explain it later. Jung observed that this presence quality makes people more attractive to others. There's something compelling about someone who is fully present rather than mentally occupied with managing perceptions. This quality of authentic presence draws others in, because it's increasingly rare in our explanation-obsessed culture. But perhaps Jung's most important insight about explaining yourself relates to personal growth. When you constantly justify your choices to others, you remain stuck in patterns that may not serve you. You become invested in defending your current way of being, rather than remaining open to growth and change. When you stop explaining yourself, you create space for evolution. You can change your mind, try new approaches, and grow in new directions without feeling like you need to justify every shift to everyone around you. This flexibility is essential for psychological development and personal fulfillment. Jung's research showed that people who master this principle often report feeling more authentic in their relationships. They're not performing for others or trying to manage impressions. They can simply be themselves and let their actions speak for their character. This authenticity creates deeper, more meaningful connections because it invites others to be genuine as well. The transformation that happens when you stop explaining yourself is often gradual but profound. You begin to notice how much mental energy you were spending on managing other people's opinions. You realize how many decisions you were making based on how you'd explain them rather than on what actually felt right to you. Jung found that this shift often leads to what he called aligned action, making choices that are consistent with your deepest values rather than with external expectations. When your actions align with your authentic self, you naturally feel more confident and less need for external validation. This principle is particularly powerful in professional settings. Jung observed that leaders who don't feel compelled to explain every decision are often more effective because they can act quickly and decisively. They gather information, consult with others when appropriate, make decisions, and move forward without getting stuck in endless justification cycles. But Jung also recognized that learning not to explain yourself can be challenging in relationships where the other person is used to receiving explanations. Some people may initially react negatively when you stop justifying your choices to them. Jung found that this reaction often reveals the unhealthy dynamics that were present in the relationship all along. True friends and healthy partners will respect your right to make your own decisions without requiring detailed justifications. Those who become upset when you stop explaining yourself may have been unconsciously controlling the relationship through their need to approve your choices. Jung's insight about explaining yourself connects to his broader theory about psychological development. He believed that becoming a fully realized individual requires developing internal rather than external sources of validation. When you can trust your own judgment without constant confirmation from others, you've achieved what Jung called psychological maturity. This maturity doesn't mean you stop caring about others or their feelings. It means you care for them from a place of strength rather than neediness. You can offer support and love without requiring their approval in return. This creates healthier, more balanced relationships where both parties can grow and evolve. Jung also noted that stopping the compulsion to explain yourself often reveals how much of your identity was built on other people's opinions. When you stop seeking external validation, you might initially feel uncertain about who you are. Jung saw this as a necessary part of the individuation process, the journey toward becoming your authentic self. This uncertainty is temporary but important. It forces you to develop your own sense of identity based on your actual values and experiences, rather than on how you think others see you. This internal work is essential for psychological health and personal fulfillment. As you practice not explaining yourself, Jung observed that you develop what he called quiet confidence. This isn't the loud, defensive confidence that comes from trying to prove yourself to others. It's the calm assurance that comes from knowing who you are and trusting your own judgment. This quiet confidence is magnetic because it's rare. Most people are so focused on managing impressions and seeking approval that encountering someone who is genuinely self-assured is refreshing and attractive. This quality often leads to more opportunities and stronger relationships because people are drawn to authentic self-confidence. Jung's final insight about explaining yourself was perhaps his most profound. When you stop justifying your existence to others, you finally begin to live it fully. The energy you were spending on explanation becomes available for creation, growth, and genuine connection. You shift from defending your life to actually living it. This transformation affects every area of your existence. Your relationships become more authentic, your work becomes more fulfilling, and your personal growth accelerates because you're no longer constrained by the need to justify every step to others. You become free to follow your own path and trust your own wisdom. Remember, Jung spent his entire career studying human psychology and observing the patterns that lead to fulfillment versus suffering. His insight about explaining yourself isn't just theoretical mine, it's based on decades of clinical observation and personal experience. He saw how this simple shift in behavior could transform someone's entire life experience. The people who command respect, who achieve their goals, and who live fulfilling lives, understand intuitively what Jung discovered through years of research. Your power lies not in your ability to explain yourself, but in your willingness to trust yourself. When you stop seeking external validation for your choices, you begin to access the internal wisdom that has been there all along. So the next time you feel the urge to explain yourself, remember Jung's insight. Ask yourself, am I sharing this information because it's helpful, or am I seeking validation for my choices? Am I communicating from confidence or from insecurity? The answer to these questions will guide you toward the psychological freedom that Jung knew was possible for all of us. Your life is yours to live. Your choices are yours to make. Your path is yours to walk. When you truly understand this truth and stop seeking permission from others to be who you are, you'll discover the psychological power that Jung knew was your birthright all along. Stop explaining yourself and start living yourself. The difference will transform everything.